Greetings, fellow scribes! Welcome back to the archive. This week I begin a 5-part series talking about Cyberpunk Red, the most recent edition of the Cyberpunk RPG. Previous editions, Cyberpunk 2020 and Cyberpunk, were set in 2020 and 2013 respectively. Cyberpunk Red is set in what's called the Time of the Red, which is currently 2045. This is about 20-something years ahead of the original Cyberpunk 2020 timeline. And of course, the timeline has advanced with a number of events between 2020, 2023, and the current timeline. Of course, Cyberpunk's a little bit bigger than can really be covered in one overall video for history. So, I'm going to be doing the focus in 2 parts. This week, I'm going to talk about the world history. The next part, which will be next week, I'll be talking about the history of Night City itself. And then, of course, when I talk about setting, I'll be talking about the more generic setting aspects in the first setting video, and I will be doing a setting focus on Night City in the second setting video. And finally, I will talk about the systems and character creation of Cyberpunk Red. I might end up splitting character creation into 2 videos, though, just because it's a very interesting system with multiple levels of character creation. All that said, let's sit back, relax, and enjoy as I talk about what led to the Time of the Red. Let me start with this. Cyberpunk is the future of the 80s. Maybe the mid to late 80s, but still the future of the 80s. Cyberpunk 2020 is the future of the 80s, seen through the moving lens of the 90s. And Cyberpunk Red is the future of the 80s, translated through the 90s, and seen now through the modern eye. What this means is things are a little different than our own history. Because 2013 and 2020, which set the world history, were written before many of the early formative events of their history happened. Because it was always a game of the dark future. And now it has become a game of a dark alternate future, because the history of the world is an alternate history. Where it diverges from our real-world timeline is 1990. What you start off with is a weak-willed president and a hungry, psychopathic vice president. H.H. Hunt was the VP, and he got together with the heads of the DEA, the FBI, the CIA, and the NSA. And with those groups under his thumb, first it became called, later on, the Gang of Four, because it was made up of 4 parts. Second, he used these for great power, supporting his lackeys supporting his donors, and supporting himself. One of the things that came out of the Gang of Four is what's called the First Central American Conflict. And basically, it is the U.S. sent troops to South and Central America to deal with the drug cartels. Well, the drug cartels didn't like it, and in retaliation for the U.S. attacks on Bogota, the Colombian drug lords detonated a tac nuke in New York City. 15,000 were killed. At the same time, a fledgling company called Biotechnica developed a new fuel source, CHOOH2, also called Choo-Choo. And this fuel will eventually replace gasoline or petrol in most of the world. But right now, it's just what it is. Something new that was developed. Also in the 90s, the European Space Agency actually launched the Hermes spaceplane. There was of course, the European Economic Community was formed in 92, and the Soviet Union fell. However, there's another bunch of things that happen. The USDA developed and spread designer plagues worldwide, targeting coca and opium plants. And the first high-energy laser lift arrays were developed. And a simple mass driver was built on the Canary Islands by the European Space Agency. As well as the first man-machine interface chips, TRC biologic interface chips, were developed in Munich, in Germany. The world stock market collapses in 1994. And basically the US was caught manipulating European and American stock markets, and the news got made public, and because of the manipulation, the trust in the stock markets plummeted, which caused the stock market crash. And we have a new space race begun between the US, the European community, and the Neo-Soviets. And the European Space Agency works with the Pan-African Alliance to start building the Kilimanjaro mass driver. 96 is considered the collapse of the United States. This is kind of tricky because the United States doesn't actually go away, but what happens is you have a number of independent states forming, like North and South California, the Dakotas, Washington State, Oregon. A whole number of states basically declare themselves free states, not paying taxes to the United States, etc., etc. They're still nominally part of the United States. They didn't secede, but they've just declared that they were not going to follow U.S. laws and not pay taxes to the U.S. On top of that, there's a number of plagues getting loose in the U.S. One of them, called the wasting disease, has the effect that no matter how much you ate, you starved to death. Because it went into your intestines and interfered with the absorption of nutrients. Yeah. And of course, there might have been some genetically engineered plagues that ended up in these states and around the world too. But large numbers of people died before vaccines were developed. And yes, I know, this kind of sounds a little familiar right now to people alive in the year 2020, real world. And what's happened is about 1 in 4 Americans are now homeless by 1996. And they are starting to band into traveling groups. And these traveling groups, in a sort of modern Grapes of Wrath style migration, riot for living space throughout the U.S. These nomads spring up originally on the West Coast and spread rapidly throughout the country. And at this time, you also see the first appearance of booster gangs. These are basically gangs with some limited cyberware and vehicles, basically trying to steal boost cars to keep themselves going. And why it's called the collapse of the U.S. is in 96, the U.S. Constitution is suspended and martial law declared. At the same time, starting in 97 to 98, you have what's called the Mideast Meltdown. A limited nuclear war starts in the Middle East. And that causes the fuel supply to drop in half. Hey, good thing Biotechnica developed Chew-2 back in the early 90s, isn't it? I kind of wonder if it was necessarily nations involved in the Mideast Meltdown. And of course, you have a major drought in the U.S. in 1998, and a 10.5 earthquake strikes Los Angeles. 35% of the city is under the Pacific Ocean now. Coming into 2000, you have a number of millennium cults basically go into, mass suicide and violence because the world didn't end like they wanted it to because of Y2K. The extended family gangs start showing up. Gangs that are more of that consider themselves a family begin popping up. And the construction of the Crystal Palace space station at Lagrange Point 1 begins. This is all 2000. The framework of the net is laid down in 2001 when the WorldSat network goes up. 2002, you have what's called the food crash. Mutated plant viruses wipe out Canadian and neo-Soviet crops. U.S. agribusinesses barely survive because they had a biological counteragent. Coincidence, isn't it? The neo-Soviets, needless to say, accused the U.S. of biological warfare. 2003 starts the Second Central American conflict. Second Central American War. And this war is when the U.S. deploys its first 10,000 cyberware-enhanced soldiers to test them out. It is also in 2003 that reporter Tesla Johansson has found transcripts from the First Central American War that revealed the Gang of Four's manipulations to the American people. And that ends up ultimately bringing down the Gang of Four. The next year, Tesla Johansson is assassinated in Cairo. 2004 also brings us the first corporate war. And this was basically two corps got into a war with each other. And their security forces and such engaged in actual open conflict. And then the next important development, the cyber modem, was invented in 2005. Braindance technology, which is where you record your experiences and someone else can play them back, was developed at University of California, Santa Cruz in 2007. 2008 brought us the second corporate war between Soviet oil and petrochem. And that's sort of a big issue because, well, it kind of freaked people out because the level of violence was so extreme that even cynical, jaded observers were surprised at it. And this war was fought over newly discovered oil fields in the South China Sea. Next major event starts in 2013. Johnny Silverhand, a rocker boy, had a concert in Night City that spiraled into a riot and burned out the old Arasaka complex. A program, the Soul Killer virus, was developed by Alt Cunningham. The idea of it was it would be something that they could implant personalities into cloned bodies, because cloned bodies are just now becoming viable. It's just there's no way to put a personality into them. NetWatch goes from being a private organization to a worldwide organization through a joint U.S. Eurotheater treaty. And as a side note, in 2011, 2 years before all this, the Crystal Palace space station at Lagrange 1 was finished. The Third Corp War starts in 2016. Unknown cyber terrorists attack the corporate networks worldwide. To this day, no one really knows who launched the attack. And the Chicago Rebuilding Project begins in 2020. It was financed by Dr. Richard Storm of Storm Technologies, and part of it is that it joins a large number of nomad groups to fly under the Aldecaldo and Jade family banners. 2022, a number of stuff happens. First, the Netrunner Supreme, Raish Bartmoss, dies. And 2 weeks after his death, a dead man switch triggers. The data crash virus activates and attacks the infrastructure of the net. This virus was actually built into the very architecture of the net. This meant that, frankly, the net had to be torn down. The plug had to be pulled on it. And it took a couple years before NetWatch finally did that, because they were trying to salvage things. And you can still find stuff in the remains of the old net. It's just really, really dangerous to do so. The other thing that started in 2022 is the Fourth Corporate War. It starts with covert operations between Arasaka and Militech, and it moved open and hot. And it was essentially a world war with the corporate forces fighting in the hearts of cities. Meanwhile, the O'Neill Cylinder 2 declared its independence and using various methods, including scavenged mass drivers, dropped dozens of lunar rocks and other forms of orbital artillery at key sites all over the planet. The U.S. and Japan officially recognize the government of at O'Neill 2. This, by the way, is called the 7-Hour War. 2023 is the big event. This is also considered the start of the Time of the Red. On August 20th, 2023, Johnny Silverhand sets off a nuke in the Arasaka Tower. The nuke was supposed to go off in the basement, destroying the data archives, the last clean remnants of the old net. Instead, it went off on the 120th floor, far earlier than it was supposed to. It blew the Arasaka Towers in half, which fortunately made the fallout situation a lot less bad than it should have been. It is stated that if it had gone off where it was supposed to, the heavily armored and secured architecture around that location would have absorbed the majority of the blast and just destroyed there and the Arasaka Tower, not caused the shockwaves through the landfill that makes up most of Night City. The fallout from this, combined with the dust from the orbital attacks in the 7-Hour War, created a red sky for months. And even for 20 years later, the sunsets around the world are tinged blood red, as well as the sunrises. And the fourth corporate war ends in 2025. It ends because the current president of the United States nationalized Militech by activating the commission of reservist CEO of Militech. And yeah. Now, as a result of all of these things, you have a sort of diaspora. People leaving the still remaining cities, going to the abandoned cities, trying to reclaim them. These people are, of course, called reclaimers. And old tech is being looted. This is from 2026 to 2030. Arasaka breaks into 3 warring factions. And very limited private networks are established within corporate parks. AIs occasionally creep into the old nets of the wrecked cities to seek out other AIs to join the ghost world that's being created by the program that is Alt Cunningham. And what is left of the United States is now a functional dictatorship under President Elizabeth Kress and her state of emergency. The nomad high roads, which basically are the interstates, but less formalized, are reestablished in between 2030 and 2035, and city nets, local VPNs in some of the reclaimed cities start being established. They're air-gapped with only limited access between them. NetWatch oversees development of these because, well, essentially, building these will help eventually build the new net. First wave cities are starting reclamation. These are the ones that require only a limited amount of resources to rebuild. Cities like, say, Chicago. And Night City is not one of these first wave cities, but it is already under reconstruction. And a lot of the old corporate factories are being rebuilt, and because all that bad stuff that happened, They lost a lot of factories, a lot of facilities. The Fourth Corporate War was brutal on not just Arasaka and Militech, but all the corporations. Netwatch attempts to clear the Rabbids. Yes, the Rabbids. Rach Bartmoss, as part of his failsafe, deployed a bunch of self-replicating AIs programmed to attack his enemies. And as they got more and more of them, and no Rach Bartmoss to control them, they started just attacking anyone on the old net. That's part of why they had to shut down the old net. And Netwatch attempts to clear out the Rabbids and reestablish the old net, but after 3 years they give up and shut down. And they're still trying to find a solution. There's some indication they're negotiating with the various AIs to try and solve issues. But right now, you can't just sit in a nice, safe place and go net running into a corporate facility. You gotta go into the corporate facility. And because of the still large homeless population, the first mega buildings are being built. Large buildings that are sort of all-in-one arcologies designed to rapidly create safe, habitable zones. At the same time, data pools are being created. Information servers and exchanges so that people can share information within a city. They're only within a city, mind you. And they kind of produce... They're the things that artists are making use of. Medias, rocker boys, anyone who does any sort of artistic, creative, or informational endeavors, they post everything to the data pools. And it's kind of funny because they're similar to the old BBSs abandoned in the 90s. Back before even the old net was a thing. And finally we come to 2045, the present. And that is a summary of the history and what I felt were the major shaping events for Cyberpunk Red. There are a lot that I skipped. I really focused on just the things that I felt were the major events. Next week, I'll be talking about a more specific history, the history of the default setting of Cyberpunk Red, and Cyberpunk 2020, and Cyberpunk 2013, namely Night City itself. So until then, I'd like you all to remember to have fun, keep gaming.